In this video, I'm going to give you some visual demonstrations of what compression will actually do to a sound source, and we're going to have a listen too. But this is really helpful in understanding what a compressor is doing on a large scale and also on a small scale. So on a large scale, just evening out the dynamics, making the loud things quieter, and on a small scale, adjusting the transient and how loud the transient, the attack of the note is in comparison to the rest. So we're going to look at a vocal and also a snare, and this is going to be really interesting. If you've never done this before, you've never seen this, I think this is going to really help you understand what compression is doing. So let's dive right in. Hey, Rob here from Musician on a Mission. This video was actually inspired by a question that I had from one of my students, and I'm just putting together a backlog of videos now for the coming months. So before we start, I just wanted to let you know that if there's a topic that you want covered, just leave it in the comments below and I'll look through those when this goes live. Okay, so let's get started here. The first thing we're going to look at is just a voice. So this is my voice, so this might get a little bit confusing because I'm talking now and this is going to be me talking, but hopefully it's clear enough. I'm going to stop talking now and hit play on this so you can just hear the original recording. This is a recording of me talking really loudly and then really quietly to show the use of compression on a vocal. Ha! So that's kind of funny, but that's the original recording. Now let's see what the compressor's doing visually on the plugin itself, and we can have a listen, and then we're going to actually look at the waveform that I printed onto a new channel from this compressor. But first, let's see what this is doing. This is a recording of me talking really loudly and then really quietly. So as you expect, on the louder notes, there's more gain reduction being applied. This needle goes all the way down to -10, which means the compressor is clamping it down by around 10 decibels. Pretty normal stuff. We can actually hear it happening as well. We can hear that those louder notes are quieter now in comparison and everything's more in line. Now, the attack time I've got set here is 5 milliseconds. So this isn't going to be as noticeable in the vocal. We're going to talk about attack time a lot more in a minute when we get to the snare. Let's just focus on the large scale with this voice. So we're not going to focus so much on the small scale or the micro, which is where we're tweaking the attack time and changing how loud the transient is in relation to the rest of the note, that initial onset. Instead, with the voice, we're just going to look at kind of on a bigger scale, on a macro scale, how it looks. So this is that compressor printed to a new channel, exactly the same recording, but you can see already how it's so much more even and it's leveled out. This really loud note here, suddenly a lot quieter. These really quiet parts here kind of look louder in comparison. This really loud part here that looks like it clips, but I think that's just the way we've got the waveform showing. It might even clip. That's being reduced quite a bit as well, quite drastically. Now with the quiet notes, it's not actually turning up the quiet notes. It's just because we compressed the loud notes and then we turn the whole thing up. So now they are kind of louder in comparison, but that's because we turn the whole thing up, not because the compressor actually turns those up. The compressor clamps down on the loud ones, then we turn the whole thing up. That's what the makeup gain is, which I've got set here. So it's got 3.5 dB of makeup gain, which means these quiet parts are 3.5 dB louder. And as we just scan through the whole recording, same thing. It's just evening out the dynamics. So that's on a large scale, on a macro scale. Now let's look at a snare, because you can't really see this on a voice. If we zoomed right in, you might be able to see how it's kind of affecting the transient, but it's not very noticeable because we don't have a really clear transient. On a snare, however, we do have this super clear transient right here. If I zoom out even more, you can see it. That's the initial onset of the note. That's the transient. So let's listen to the original recording, and we're going to bypass any compression. So we've got a bit of bleed as well, but pretty standard snare recording. Now, this first one that I want to show you is actually an 1176 emulation, which is this plugin here. So this is an analog compressor, a really popular compressor for drums, kick, snare, even the drum bus. This is a Waves emulation of that analog compressor. Now, the great thing about these is that they have a really fast attack time. So the attack time here, even though it's 1 through 7, that's not in milliseconds like you might be used to with your stock compressor. Instead, that's just kind of an inherent scale of this compressor. And it's the opposite. 1 is like slow and 7 is fast. So I had it set around here somewhere. So it's not milliseconds, it's just we're using quite a slow attack time here. But even so, the slowest attack time on an 1176 compressor is super fast. It's microseconds. So with a lot of kind of stock compressors, they only really go down to like either 0 or 0.5 and then 1 millisecond. With this, we're down at like, you know, 1/10 of a millisecond in microseconds. And even at the slower setting, it's still microseconds. So it's really, really, really fast. And the same on the release. So let's leave this engaged and actually listen to what it's doing before we look at the waveform below. So it looks like every note is kind of the same. On a macro scale this time, we're not really changing it much. Every single hit is compressing by around 3 dBs, whereas with the voice, it was kind of all over the place. This is obviously a more consistent instrument in terms of volume. It's just this pretty similar hit every single time. But on a micro scale is where we're going to really see the difference with the attack and the transients. So let's zoom in and compare now. So I printed that 1176 to this track here. And again, we can listen, but it's going to be exactly the same. Slightly different volume. But the biggest difference we can see is that the transient is quieter in comparison. Now, kind of like by this point, I guess it looks pretty similar to me. But here, it's so much quieter at the transient. Big difference. And now that's because it's a really fast compressor. So it's reacting fast enough to actually clamp down on the transient. So that's pretty much what it's doing. It sounds more compressed. We've got a more even snare sound, but it does also kind of add this punchiness. We still have like a transient that's louder than the rest. And an 1176 will just kind of make it sound thicker. But if we use the slower attack time, generally a bit punchier than using a fast attack time. But the main thing just kind of that I want to draw your attention to here is the fact that the transient is compressed. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Let's pull up a different compressor. And again, we're just going to listen first. So this time it's just a stock Logic compressor and I've got it set to 0 milliseconds. So arguably this should be like instant. It should be like a look ahead limiter or something where it's actually looking ahead and it's instantly clamping down. That's not actually the case. Even though this says 0.0, that's not what's happening under the hood. Because if we look at the waveform, again printed here, the transient's louder, which doesn't make any sense. So what's going on here? We've added compression. We've used the fastest attack time possible. So theoretically, the compressor is reacting so fast that it should be clamping down on the transient and making the transient quieter. But it's actually doing the complete opposite. Look, the transient's even louder now in comparison to the rest. Overall, it looks louder in the kind of, it's like a bigger waveform here than it is here. We are comparing stereo to mono, but if you can kind of tell anyway. But on top of that, in comparison to the rest, it's actually kind of like louder relative to the rest of the snare. Here it tapers off pretty slowly, whereas here it tapers off really quickly. So this is kind of like twice as loud as here, whereas here it's like not quite twice as loud, but you know what I mean. Now, the reason this is happening is because the stock compressor isn't reacting fast enough. It says 0.0, but that's not what's actually happening. It's taken maybe half a millisecond or more to actually react. So what we've done is we've compressed everything after the transient, and the transient has remained uncompressed. And then when we apply a makeup gain, now the transient's even louder than before. So this can still work if you want a really punchy snare sound. If we compare the two, so let's have a listen to the stock compressor, which is now a slow attack time, so a louder transient in relation to the rest of the snare. It's got like more punch to the transient, and then the 1176. It's still got that punch, but it sounds beefier is the way I'd describe it, or thicker, some people use. So this is just something to be aware of. So hopefully this lets you see kind of what's going on under the hood of a compressor in terms of the attack time and what that's doing to the transient, but also the fact that with drums and with the stock compressor that comes with your DAW, and I'm not slating stock compressors, like this still sounds great. It does the job. It's still compressing it. But if you do want to have like a thicker sound and you want to actually tame the transient, arguably you do need an 1176, but there's a workaround if you don't want to go and buy an 1176 plugin, you just want to continue using the stock plugins in your DAW, and that's using a limiter. So let's have a listen again before we actually look. So solo here, and this time we're going to look at the limiter. So it's changed the sound quite drastically, and I'm using pretty drastic settings here. You can see I'm applying like 12 dB of gain reduction, which you would never normally do. And we've lost all the transient. Hopefully you can kind of hear that a bit already. And if we actually look at it, straight away you can see it's just shaved off the transient like this. So in comparison, we basically have no transient. And look, it's just kind of like level. We don't have this kind of like tapering off. It's just level the whole time. Now, this isn't like a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't use a limiter on your snare. I'm just trying to show you how all of these tools act differently. So when you're trying to decide what to do and you have an intent, and that needs to come first. You need to listen to the snare and think, okay, this is way too punchy. It's like the transient's really aggressive. I need to dull the transient. Then either reach for like an 1176 or a limiter. Whereas if you're like, okay, I want this to sound punchier, then you're going to use a compressor with the slower attack time. And you can still get a punchy sound out in 1176 as well. It still kind of has that punch to it, even though it is shaving the transient a bit. It's just the very first bit of the transient, literally the kind of the very instant that the beater hits the snare, we still have here. So we still have like a lot of the punch of the snare itself. We're just shaving off the transient a tiny bit. What I would recommend, takeaways from this, to actually go and apply this knowledge to your own mixes as opposed to just kind of being theoretical here, is that first of all, it doesn't really matter what compressor you're using. You can use your stock compressor, just be aware that it is going to kind of sound different and it's not going to be really fast. But on things that don't need to be fast, like vocals, like bass, like guitar, those kind of things, obviously it doesn't matter. And then when it comes to snare drums, kick drums, if you do want to try and dull the transient a bit, just make sure you're using the fastest possible setting. And that's still going to do pretty much the same thing as an 1176. However, if you really want to shave the transient, you can use a limiter, and I would just use, 2-3 dB of limiting on the snare just to dull that transient a bit if you do find that it's poking through the mix a bit too much. Generally though, just throwing on a compressor is enough. If I have a snare and I want to kind of make it sound beefier and at the same time more consistent and a bit punchier, I'll just throw on a compressor. The stock one's fine, and we can do a before after comparison here, just kind of making the snare sound better. So it's still adding punch, it's still adding kind of thickness, it's making it sound better, it's making it more consistent. I just wanted you to be aware of kind of how these tools differ and what's actually going on under the hood when it comes to the very small scale. So that's it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you find that useful. Like I said, leave a comment below this video with your requests for upcoming videos, topics you want to see covered, questions you have that haven't been answered anywhere else on YouTube. Whatever it is, drop a comment and I'll have a look through, and whichever comments get kind of the most upvotes, I'll make a video on. So make sure you upvote, thumb up, whatever it is, other videos, requests that you want to see. And that's it for today. So I'll see you next time. And remember, create regardless.